Welcome, everybody. I'm Melanie Asher-Blair with the Arizona Telemedicine Program and the Southwest Telehealth Resource Center. This is a DEI credit registration as a QR code for the University of Arizona College of Medicine Tucson faculty, residents, fellows, and staff. You know what to do with this. I'm going to go to the next slide. It will show up again, and I will put the URL in the chat in just a moment. So the University of Arizona, we have a land acknowledgement that we'd like to state. We respectfully acknowledge the University of Arizona is on the land and territories of Indigenous peoples. Today, Arizona is home to 22 federally recognized tribes, with Tucson being the home to the O'odham and the Yaqui. Committed to diversity and inclusion, the university strives to build sustainable relationships with sovereign Native nations and Indigenous communities through education offerings, partnerships, and community service. I'd like to introduce you to Charmaine, and she will continue on with our program. Charmaine?
Thank you, Melanie. Can everybody hear me? Yes. Great. So the National REACH Coalition welcomes you to one of our webinars in the series that we launched back in April of 2022, Who Tells Our Story Shapes Our Destiny. We want to particularly thank our Arizona friends who have made this webinar series possible. Next slide. So again, welcome. Next slide. So webinar tips and notes for you to make a note of. As you notice, when you joined the webinar, your phone and computer were muted. Hang on, I just lost my, give me 1 second. Yes. So you were muted, but time is reserved at the end for question and answer. Please use the chat functions to ask your questions. And at the very end, we're asking you to complete a post-webinar survey that has been very helpful to inform us as to how successful or not the webinar was, today's webinar was, and to solicit from you your input that will help us improve our future webinars. The webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be posted on our Arizona Telemedicine Program website. Next slide. And that's just some information for the technical support resources that are available for you. Great. And so we are at the beginning of a fantastic webinar. Back in January, approximately 2 months ago, January 26th, we had the first in what we have determined will be a two-part webinar series focused on the African American community. The National REACH Coalition, which got started in 2004 with a group of REACH grantees, has been doing webinars that are focused on the populations represented by REACH grantees. So African American, Latinos, Native Americans, Asian American, Pacific Islanders. Another set of webinars will be coming soon, and so keep your ears and eyes open as we announce those future webinars. So in early 2022, we were particularly concerned about what was happening in our country with the telling of the stories of people of color. I remember I had an epiphany. I brought it back to the board members of the National Reach Coalition. I was on a webinar where people who were not of nor from the community they were representing on work that was being done in the community. And in listening to the presentations by those folks, it struck me that there were two types of presenters. There were some who presented acknowledging that they were working with the community, were there on behalf of the community, had been entrusted by the community to share the stories of the work that they had been doing, to showcase the community and the community's work, and to tell the stories that had been determined by the community. So clearly, they acknowledged upfront that they were merely there on behalf, at the behest of the community, and it was the community's work that they were sharing. And then there was another category of presenters, one who presented as if it was their right to be the spokesperson for the community. In speaking to our first panel group back in January, one of the panelists put it in a conversation that struck me, characterizing it thus. It's as if the ghostwriter of a story had determined that it was their story to tell instead of the authors, and the community was relegated merely to the passive role of being a backdrop. And that captured very much what the National Reach Coalition figured we needed to embark on these series where we had representation from all the people of color coming and talking about their stories. We were particularly struck, as almost everybody who's passed through the last 3 years of COVID-19 and the stories that were coming out from the different communities of color, stories that in many instances did not look as if they were telling their stories, but that others were telling it for them. This against what is a emerging national discourse around CRT, around the 1619 Project, around Native Americans' real history versus the history that has been told in so-called history books or Hollywood movies, and the stories we've been hearing of Jewish history, especially that pertaining to the Holocaust, that seeks to be rewritten. Recently, we even heard reports that a children's book on Rosa Parks had been banned, and a recent textbook that included Rosa Parks had deleted mention of race. I learned this morning reading a social media post that a parent had complained about a film on Ruby Bridges, on the story of a very brave 6-year-old who helped to desegregate schools in New Orleans. And the parent had decided that they wanted that film banned because there was a perception that it would shape how white children felt about Black children. It seems that the key to understanding this discourse and their authors and the loud voices almost hysterically calling for these revisions is that it serves to control how those communities are perceived. Most importantly, how those communities perceive themselves, and ultimately who gets to shape their community's future. Who tells our story shapes our destiny. So we have a wonderful panel that are going to help us understand how they have worked in their respective communities to help own their stories, reclaim their stories if necessary, and how that is shaping the future and destiny of the African American communities. I want to first introduce you quickly to Dr. Kent Key, who is a health equity scholar, racial and ethnic health disparities researcher, and a community engaged research methodologist. Dr. Key is an assistant professor at the Michigan State University College of Human Medicine in the Charles Stewart Mott Department of Public Health. He has an interest in urban minority population and uses qualitative research methods to evaluate the perceptions and lived experience with a goal towards the development of community-driven solutions for health equity. You can read Dr. Key's bio, which is extensive and impressive, in the flyer that we have been sharing promoting this webinar. Next, I want to let you know about Dr. Cheryl Taylor. Cheryl is a longtime friend of the National Reach Coalition, having been part in the early years of Reach, heading up Reach, I think it was Reach at the Heart of New Orleans. She's currently an associate professor of nursing, was past chairperson of the graduate nursing programs, led academic and administrative work for Louisiana School of Nursing over several years and several programs. She has a DNP and PhD in nursing and served as interim dean from 2011 to 2012. The next I want to introduce, and that was the word I was struggling to find a few seconds ago, the Reverend Dr. Lamont Wimbish, Senior. He's pastor of Amazing Grace World Fellowship. Pastor Wimbish received his Bachelor of Theology, Master of Divinity, Doctor of Divinity, and Doctor of Biblical Exegesis from the Frederick L. Ray Biblical Institute on the Central Virginia campus, where he served as Vice President until 2020. And you can read the extensive bios of all three of our panelists at your leisure. And so we're going to ask the panelists, starting with Dr. Cheryl Taylor, to speak a few minutes, introduce herself, talk a little bit about her work, and what she brings to this discussion on how African Americans are telling their story and shaping their destiny. Dr. Taylor.
Thank you. And I want to thank everyone involved in making this webinar happen. And I also want to salute all members of the indigenous tribes all over the country. And thank you for everything that you've brought to this nation. So my name is Cheryl Taylor, and I'm a former principal investigator of Reach 2010 at the Heart of New Orleans. It was the first generation of Reach projects, and we were charged and funded to initially eliminate cardiovascular disease among African American women in faith-based environment. We had to start off on the right track, and that's part of who I am, is in looking at, was that realistic and feasible to eliminate something that already exists? So through collaboration, dialogue, truth-telling, the language was changed to reduce the risk factors of cardiovascular disease among African American women. That was our target population in New Orleans. And we had a very successful project, and I can talk more about that later. I teach at the Southern University in Baton Rouge School of Nursing, and I serve in, I'm a member of the community. So that's the best way for me to introduce myself, because I'm a person first, a member of the community, and I choose not to be in bondage by any titles I acquired since I was gone through processes. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Taylor. Looking forward to a further conversation. Next, I'm going to ask Pastor Wimbish if he would spend a few minutes introducing himself.
Certainly. Greetings, one and all, and thank you for inviting me to be a part of this fantastic webinar. And like I said, ditto to what Dr. Taylor said also. But going briefly with my story, I grew up in Richmond, Virginia, a neighborhood called Washington Park. It was a neighborhood that was deeded to African-American families by Mr. Lewis Ginter, who was a large philanthropist in the Richmond area. Curiously enough, he lived in New York. He moved to Richmond when he failed his businesses in New York. He joined the Confederacy during the Civil War. Then after the Civil War, he started being a philanthropist. So I thank God for that, because we had a community that was self-sufficient. Okay, we had two churches, 3 stores, cleaners, a lot of people who were inclined to be contractors and whatever. So it was said that we could stay in our community and never go outside for anything. And that's the kind of connectivity that I grew up in. After I left there, one bit of curious history people like to inquire about. While in high school, I joined an organization that was called the Black Panther Party. And that story that was told out, okay, was not the story that I lived when I was involved in that. All that we did in the community in Gilpin Court, downtown Richmond, was free breakfast programs, free clothing programs, cleaning up the neighborhood. So that's how I got introduced into community efforts and community work. Long story short, left there, went to school, graduated, got into electronics, and moved from electronics into scientific instrumentation. Spent the best part of my career working in a pharmaceutical laboratory on LC-MS, MS systems, where they're doing drug research to come up with new answers to some of the diseases that plague us. So having said all of that, I also did mission work. I've been to Uganda, Kenya, Nigeria, Ghana, Tanzania, doing mission work in my early ministry. So I've seen both the glories of riches and the devastation of lack of riches. So then I became a pastor. So I'm a pastor now in Amazing Grace World Fellowship. We like to say a little church with a great big heart. And that is my story.
Thank you, Pastor Wimbish. Dr. Key?
Yes, so first of all, good afternoon to everyone. And it is a privilege to be here on this panel with such great panelists, with such a wonderful history. So I guess I'm kind of bringing it up a little bit later in the generation. I got introduced to public health in 2000. I was completing high school, going into college, and the Reach 2010 project in Genesee County looking at infant mortality was happening. And so Reach and some of the work of the Prevention Research Center around violence prevention, youth violence prevention, those were some of the earlier projects that introduced me to public health into this field because I was a community member. I was an engineering student who happened to go into the AmeriCorps program, and that's how I got introduced to public health. So I got introduced to health disparities and start realizing that people like me, people like my family and my community members were dying at disproportionate rates when compared to others, when compared to other races and to other demographics. And so that lit a fire in me to become a health disparities researcher. I worked for about 9 years at University of Michigan in the medical school there. I'm currently at Michigan State University, where I'm looking at health disparities across health indicators. So I'm not just the stroke guy or the cancer guy or I'm looking at disparities across, looking at how can we use community engaged methodologies to address not only the issue, but to develop community-driven solutions. This panel is very important to me because I'm from Flint, Michigan, still live in Flint, Michigan, where the water crisis is still happening. It's just not in the news. It's not over. The water was switched, but we still have not had all of the service lines replaced. And we're dealing with the backlash of all of the health issues that related, because it was more than just lead in the water. People just talked about lead because it got people's attention. And when we think about COVID and the stories of COVID, how they were then this was compounding to the Flint community, because some of the issues around the water exposure was respiratory issues, right? And we know respiratory issues were packed in this conversation, looking at the experience specifically unique to Flint with the water crisis, then following that with the pandemic. So I'm excited to be here and looking forward to the discussion.
Dr. Key, I think I'm going to start with you because your last comments are a nice segue into the questions we're going to ask you and your fellow panelists to respond to. So as we're all aware, the stories that got told, and I mentioned this in my earlier comments, the stories that were being told by COVID-19, particularly the experiences of people of color, were fascinating. So my first question, did your community find that their experience of COVID-19 was being told by others in a way that did not reflect the experiences that they were having? Dr. Keith?
Of course, the narrative and the powers and industries and sectors at will were trying to shape that narrative, as we saw across the country. I think what was unique in Flint was there was a lot of pushback, allowing others to tell the story, because that's what happened with us in the water crisis. People wanted to come in and tell the story, tell the narrative. And I think we had built up so many kind of community level interventions and entities and groups to where, yes, that there was attempts to do that, of course, but I think the residents of Flint were able to kind of check those narratives very quickly because of what happened in Flint. But I think the greatest narrative that was that many, because Flint is a majority African-American city. It's majority African-American. It's like a smaller version of Detroit, which at the time, Detroit was historically majority African-American. But the issue with the COVID narrative in Flint was not so much the dominant narrative of people trying to tell our story. It was really having to listen to government, right? Listening to the messages coming out of government on how to address COVID-19 with a city that did not trust government because government poisoned their water supply, right? So it was nuanced in the types of narratives that we had to kind of address and to deal with. But yes, of course, the dominant media engine, of course, tried to shape the narrative. But I think they were met with a lot of resistance and pushback in Flint because of what just happened prior with the water crisis.
So the Flint experience that preceded COVID really had people prepared and ready.
Yes, so for example, we had a communications group that formed because of the water crisis, because messaging, there was an infodemic is what we call it, when information is not being shared properly and accurate information. We had communication groups and other groups that stayed together after the onset of the water crisis. So things like when COVID happened, these groups were already intact. Those collaborations were already there. They never stopped working together. Now, that didn't mean that it wasn't a lot of misinformation. The whole country got misinformation around COVID, but we did have some groups with social capital that folk trusted as it relates to kind of dealing with COVID. Without having those groups, it probably would have been a lot worse than what we saw in Flint. But yes, we were able to build off what was created because of the water crisis.
Great. Pastor Wimbish, I see you have unmuted yourself, so I'm taking it you want to jump in here. Go ahead.
Yes, that's very interesting, because that story, even when it comes to pharmaceutical drugs and things that can be the remedies to some of our human modalities, is very important that the correct story gets out. I was in the pharmaceutical industry for years, and most of the people that I communicated with on a friendship level or families have very little trust in pharmaceutical companies. He was talking about the water in Flint, and the first equipment I worked on was called a OWA, Organic Water Analyzer, and this is how they determine what's actually in the water. And so without that knowledge, without that being told, you have no idea what you're taking into your system. So it's the same thing with drugs. Drugs, it takes years and years and a lot of research and effort to bring a drug to market. And no drug is perfect, right? So yes, you can talk about this. My uncle took this particular drug and he died. Well, you probably had an uncle who drank some alcohol and died also. So you can't just eliminate those things. A lot of work goes into that, and the story needs to get out. So I had to convince people during COVID, that the vaccines that they were asked to take into their bodies were legitimate, okay? That there was, despite what some people were saying, the lab that I was involved in did many, many studies and tests on those COVID vaccines. So again, nothing is perfect, okay? But as far as we are able to ascertain, the benefit outweigh the possible side effects.
Thank you, Pastor Wimbish. Cheryl, again, the question is, did your community find their experiences of COVID was being told by others in a way that did not reflect their experience?
The whole story has not been told. And from the onset of COVID, there was so much misinformation in terms of African Americans caring about their health and wellness, lumping and labeling African Americans as a burden on the healthcare delivery system because of histories of chronic illness, and even calling them anti-vaxxers, almost with a tone of blame and shame. And so this, as if there were no healthcare access problems, there were no health disparities, as if none of that occurred prior to COVID. So that the whole story hasn't been told, because there were so many African Americans who, thousands who were vaccinated. Everybody wasn't vaccine hesitant, but we have been taught through the years to question, be careful from history. We have this in our history that you just don't automatically buy fried ice cream. You have to see what is going on and then decide, okay, is this what's best? So I think, and I hope, the whole story is able to be told, not just the dark side, but also the bright side, and the people who are surviving and who are taking care of their family members and who are surviving with long COVID, even those who were vaccinated. The state of Louisiana responded to COVID with the Health Disparities Task Force and really began to address the issue for the general population, but also for African Americans that were dealing with this, the death and disability that was coming from COVID. And part of the response to that has been the Louisiana Department of Health really focusing part of their activities on supporting and funding programs that are targeting COVID prevention in African Americans in rural and urban areas, and also improving the workforce of minorities out there so that we have more minorities in the clinical workforce to take care of our people.
Cheryl, I want to stay with you a little bit because you said you still don't think that the correct story or stories have been told. And so my follow-up question to you, Cheryl, and to the other panelists, how should the African American community ensure that their authentic story of their experience with COVID is told now and going forward in the future?
Well, I think our historians and our libraries have a role to play. I can walk into a church right here in Baton Rouge on any Sunday, and this is mandatory. Even today, when people think the pandemic is over. So there are what I would call COVID prevention or community health champions as pastors and community leaders that are still holding accountable and trying to protect the health of people in the community, people who are at risk. There's still activities, there's still legislatures. We have signs where legislatures are saying it's not over, mask up. So at different levels, we need to somehow archive and document the good things that have been done and are continuing to be done to help preserve and preserve our health and reduce our risk. And for some reason, there's a tendency, a media focus on, the worst.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Pastor Wimbish or Dr. Key, do you want to add anything to that response? How's the community going to ensure that their authentic experience with COVID is the narrative that gets told now and going forward in the future, especially when COVID is long behind us? Mm-hmm.
Yes, Dr. Teller was correct. We had instituted here several months ago. We have a monthly, it's not a webinar, but we do a broadcast, a live, letting people know we have a RN on staff here who was instrumental in the city of Richmond in all of the COVID prevention and getting people vaccines. We even had the opportunity to, inoculate some people here at our church. So that has to continue going on as things change. We must keep abreast with it because, as Dr. Taylor said, and as I tell people often, viruses are alive and they desire to remain alive. So whatever thing you try to use to mitigate it, they will try to circumvent that. So you have to be constantly, trying to stay ahead of the infection that they can cause. Even with environmental things going on now, COVID is not the only thing that's in the past or on the horizon. There's much more coming with global warming. A lot more modalities will be forced upon us. So we need to, in our messages, like I said, we would talk about that in our Sunday services. We have a Wednesday, I believe it's Wednesday at 7 o'clock, we would do a broadcast letting the community know. But all in still, as she said, that hesitancy still remains based on historical, some facts, some fiction, but based on historical evidences that people are reticent, to trust that the government has their best desires at hand.
Yeah, I would agree with what the panelists have both said. And I will say quarantining forced us to take a lot of our efforts to social media platforms. And it also provided an opportunity for people to tell their authentic stories without being scripted by industry or being scripted by other people. And so I think that, like in Flint, we had webinars that were happening weekly. We had the Flint Public Health Youth Academy here in Flint that was creating a platform for youth to discuss messaging around COVID and to create their own messaging, what would resonate with them. And so those types of creative community entities also, along with what Dr. Taylor mentioned, with having those trusted community messengers and pastors, et cetera, but having those types of platforms help to create and to solidify communities' authentic voice regarding COVID-19. And also, it was also very important to have those platforms so that people can engage and ask questions and not feel like they were asking a dumb question or a question that may not have been, put together in a way to where they would feel embarrassed. And also, it also helped with literacy and being able to understand some of the health language. And so I believe putting together many of these platforms helped community to capture that authentic voice around their experiences with COVID, to the point to even now, we're still having these conversations. The Youth Academy just did a series on long COVID, talking about people that are dealing with the impacts of long COVID. So these conversations are still happening.
In every community, every community has to deal with the loss and grief that has occurred as a result of COVID, every community. And, if I had my brothers, we would have a national day of grief just to spotlight that it's okay to acknowledge and recognize the grieving process and go through it and deal with it, because we have children dealing with loss of both sides of the grandparents. We have caregivers who we have so much loss and grief that we're sort of tuned out and keep moving. But this is so important as a part of our experience with COVID, with over 1 million people dying, and how many have long COVID, we don't know until we have to take it on ourselves. And hopefully we will, from our own cultures, come up and find ways that we can, in a healthy way, manage the loss and grief that we experienced during the pandemic.
Absolutely. I'm glad you raised that point, Cheryl. I'm going to move us to put in the context of telling our story, put some history to it. And so my question to the three of you, and whoever wants to answer it first, how has the history of racism in this country distorted your community's story? And how has it impacted your community's health and well-being? I don't know, who wants to start first?
Well, maybe since I assume the oldest, I will go back a little far in history. I am 70 years young, as I said, with 3 children and 10 grandchildren. As I look back at my beginnings, our parents were very strict on us being educated. Being the rebel that I was, I chose my own path of education, and I chose one that was based on technology. But the bottom line is it starts in the home. I remember in the early 1960s when my parents bought an encyclopedia set. And I read that encyclopedia as they were novels. That's how interested I was in it. So if we reach out in the families, and the families are interested in the schoolwork of their children, we can correct some of the misinformation that's out there. Because if we don't have the correct story of our journey, then we find ourselves either making up stories as we go along, or we have to listen to someone else's perception of what our story is. And so some of the pieces of our story don't jive or fit sometimes because they've been modified. So I think that I remember the 1618 Project. That was a wonderful documentary telling stories that a lot of people never heard in school. So I say it's got to be a combination. Education, we can't turn our children over to education to be raised, okay? Parents must participate. So the family structure and the education and people who know the actual story, because we can find out almost anything now with the aid of technology, find out exactly what went on and tell the true story. And those people who don't want to hear it, they're gonna resist, they're gonna shout it down. But that is what we must do, continually keep telling the story.
And so I agree with the pastor. I believe accuracy matters. And I think that we have to demand that the narrative or story be accurate. When I was growing up in New Orleans public schools, I learned a story. When a person told a story, they were telling a lie. So I see a difference between history, or what I believe we're really talking about here, we should call documentaries, and stories, because there are a lot of stories and misinformation built in those stories. But you said it at the beginning of this webinar, we are under attack. We're living in an era of revisionist history. So racism continues and is full throttle to this day. So we have these attacks on our history, our bodies, and even our future. And we have to begin to refer to what people may call stories. I think we need to begin to address them as the documentaries that they are. Just because it's an ordinary person's experience, not a famous person experience, that doesn't make it any less important. And so, yes, the racism has distorted it, but the stories continue and they're passed down, and we have to come up with a way of demanding accuracy and preserving and passing on our history to our children.
So if I may add to that, before COVID, our communities was impacted by racism and the untruths embedded in racism, right? COVID just helped to kind of magnify the disparities. When we think about how racism has and the experiences of our ancestors and our forefathers dealing with health, dealing with medicine, the mistrust, it was more than just Tuskegee. I always tell people, don't call it Tuskegee. It was the United States Public Health Syphilis Study that just happened to be housed at Tuskegee. But when we call it Tuskegee, we take the onus off of the federal government, right? So it was several examples of racist and unethical procedures and practices that had been enacted on people of color and women. I mean, look at the history of the father of gynecology, right? We can go back a long way. The issue is this: we have been trying to address the level of mistrust and distrust from communities of color as it relates to medicine and health. We're still trying to get over those humps. The communities most impacted are the communities most underrepresented as nurses and doctors and researchers. So yes, racism has made a very critical negative impact on our story, but it also shapes the lens by which people think. So when you think about behaviors now, social and health behaviors, you have, even to this day, there are African Americans that are professionals, even in medical and health, but they'll ask Big Mama first about a cure before they go to the doctor, because it's ingrained in our culture and in our thinking. So yes, racism has had an impact, but that's the work of us. That's the work of us who are here on this panel today, those that are out in the audience today, to really challenge those false narratives, to really bring to light the true impact that racism has had on communities of color, specifically African-American communities that are other than just Tuskegee, and to really look at what we need to do to create community-driven solutions so that we can get to that place of healing and restoration for our communities and the generations that come behind us.
And we should better value our history. Value our history. Others can see sometimes what we don't see or recognize, or what we take for granted in our history. So I think, along with what Dr. Kent is saying, we have to value and raise up our history. Every community advisory board should have a historian on it.
Yeah. I think also, as I agree with what they are saying, we must, like you say, go that extra step, and we look at what is behind racism. People aren't racist just because they don't like a person's color, okay? What drives racism is economics, okay? That was the whole reason it was invented. Economic slavery was economics, okay? That hasn't changed in the way that the world's economies operate today, okay? So if we can get people to look at it from the point of view that, because flip the script. If you had the chance for all of your relatives to be millionaires, but you had to subjugate somebody else, would you do it? Okay, that's how we must look at it. We have to attack that thing, because it's more than just, I don't like the way you look. It's an economic system that's driving the whole thing to potential.
I want to thank you, Pastor Wimbish, and Cheryl and Dr. Key. I want to circle back to you, Dr. Key, and frame the question a little differently. Because of the attacks that there has been on, and I named a number of them in my introductory remarks, an attempt to revise a lot of the history. I mean, if you're banning a child's book about Rosa Parks, if you're banning a film on Ruby Bridges, right? There is intent behind that. If you're challenging CRT, there is intent behind that. And one of the things that we hear from the perpetrators of these things, the ones who want to eradicate CRT and Black history and all of that, is that it makes others uncomfortable. And so the question I have, starting with you, Dr. Keys, and for the other panelists, is what impact does this new movement, this backlash, what impact are you concerned that it's having on the health and resilience of the African American community, your community in Flint, if you want to be as particular, Dr. Keys?
Well, so this playbook is nothing new. It is the same playbook. Even now, the word equity is being attacked because now it's looked at as is being politicized by those who want to keep the current system in this country operating. You know, oftentimes people say the system in America is broken. That's why we have inequities and inequalities. I challenge them and say, no, the system in America isn't broken. It's doing exactly what it was designed to do. And until we deconstruct the system and build a system that's rooted in equity and justice, we won't see changes. And oftentimes that comes with our value system. I'm concerned only if they are not champions, Ms. Sherman, who will stand up against these efforts. These efforts will never stop. Every time we find something that can advance and help those that are most marginalized, those that are most underserved, those that are most disproportionately impacted, there will be attacks on that, because that then challenges the system as is, the status quo as is. And so these types of attacks with CRT and banning books, well, knowledge. People don't want to have these discussions. And we're not shocked, because as a nation, we're not ready to talk about racism. Because by talking about racism, you have to, one, acknowledge that it exists. Then you have to get to the root of it. What is the root cause? It was economics, but in the process of it, it was creating a value system where you will ascribe a greater value to one set of human beings and another, a lesser value to others. I mean, and in all actuality, in the original Constitution, people of color and of slave origin weren't even considered human beings. They were considered less than human beings. So that whole value system has been messed up since the onset of the country. And so when we think about how can we address these things, well, we have to get to the place where we're ready to have true, transparent conversations on that national level. I mean, we can have them in these little huddles forever, but if we don't do it on a level where we have our decision makers, our policy makers, our systems leaders at the table, then we're preaching to the choir over and over and over again. And I say that also because I've been in church all my life, all that, so I can use that term faster. Used to direct the choir myself. However, the point of it is that I'm not shocked that CRT was being attacked. I'm not shocked that these books are being, because what this country has a hesitancy is coming to the recognition of truth. You know, I know we have a pastor here that's on the panel, and they talk in John 4:24, it talks about in spirit and in truth. If you don't have truth at the table, you can't move forward. And until we can come to a sense of truth of how we have gotten to where we are, how racism has been, how it has modified itself and transformed itself into systems and structures and barriers. It's not just somebody burning a cross in your yard or riding around in sheets. It is systemic. It is structural. If we can't come to the truth about that, we'll never be able to address health disparities. We'll never be able to address social and economic disparities. We'll never be able to address educational disparities if we cannot come to the truth of how these disparities were erected in the first place and the intent behind doing so.
I see that Cheryl and the pastor have unmuted themselves, but Dr. Key, I wanna push you a little bit on this and ask the question. I'm hoping the other panelists also speak to this. Yes, we have to get to the big table and all of that, but is there a concern on your part that what's happening now will have, while it's not new, it certainly has been ramped up in a way that is challenging, because many thought we had been developing past that? So is there a concern that this backlash that's happening, this reverting to some old norms, will have a negative impact on the health and resilience of the Black community?
Absolutely. Yes. Absolutely.
Yes, I want to say yes. We have to. First of all, our ancestors gave us the playbook. They didn't have all the resources that we have, and we have a responsibility to continue that legacy. So on one hand, we have a history of resilience as a people, and we should celebrate our resilience. On the other hand, we have to fight back. yes, there is. This is concerning. And this requires us coming together and really fighting back, and not just sitting back and, about the dialogue, but we have to fight back because this is our history. So schools that have requirement for African-American studies, I'm at a school that African-American studies is a requirement to graduate with a degree from this institution. Every institution that is affected by the attacks on our history has to stand up, come together, and in a collective way, fight back on this, because history and truth is transformative, not just for the people that are being talked about, but for everyone involved. And that's part of the reason why people are trying to rewrite history, because they don't want the transformation and the opportunity for peace and healing to occur that occurs when people know the truth and become free.
Amen. Amen. Hosea says, my people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. And so as we look back maybe over our childhoods, I grew up in a church also. Church was 3 doors down from my house. We had a choice. We would drug to church, okay? But the bottom line is this. We heard many a sermons preaching and pretty much on fire and brimstone. But when I grew up and was able to research scriptures, compare verses, compare Bibles, compare the sermons that are out there, my knowledge began to grow on that. So our story has to have the same track. There's so much availability now. We can find the true story. If we research, we can find what really happened. We can find out that there were institutions in Georgia and South Carolina that experimented on hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of African Americans for their misunderstanding of how the human body operates. Okay, so we can find that out. But now I think with what we have as tools, we must use our tools to get the truth in front of people. I preach here every day. Every sermon I preach has to have education and learning in it. Okay, we learn this. What did this mean? Don't just repeat what I say or repeat what you heard in a song. What does this mean? So if we look at it from that perspective, again, and I go back to what I said earlier, the family is key in this. We have to somehow stem the flow of our family being torn apart, okay, by what's going on in the world today. We must be responsible parents and grandparents and aunts and uncles, okay, and help our children so that they will come up from where we have already arrived. Ooh, y'all gonna get me preaching up in here.
Thank you, Pastor Wimbish. Thank you, Pastor Wimbish. Dr. Key, did you want to add? I'm going to take myself off camera briefly. Dr. Key, did you want to add?
Well, I was just saying yes to your question. To me, yes, I am concerned because, again, I see this as a tactic to really try to stop advancing health equity. And if that happens, then communities that are already disproportionately impacted with health issues across indicators will continue to be impacted, and we won't get out of the root that we're in as it relates to heart disease and diabetes, and I mean you can name them. It's a list of them that are all preventable. Infant mortality, maternal mortality, all of these things are rooted in racism. There's decades of research that shows you can be first of all, European American women get more breast cancer. There are more incidents of that, but more African American women die from breast cancer. Why are these things happening? If we can't address CRT and history, Black history, and books are getting pulled, we'll never get to the root cause of those things that impact communities that look like mine and that look like yours.
Thank you. So my next question has to do with stories and power. And the question is, how does the process of reclaiming our story impact reclaiming our power? I don't know who wants to take that first.
I'll just say that reclaiming your story requires reclaiming your history. And reclaiming your history requires valuing your history. And so that's what I have to say about it.
That is, I concur wholeheartedly. It is your story. As I told part of my story earlier, I went away from Richmond. I went to school in New Jersey. I got married. I got working for a large corporation. The bottom line is, for probably 3/4 of my career, I was like the oddball. I was the only dark face in a crowd of whites. Let's put it that way, make it plain truth. But that's part of my story. Now, I got that way by the grace of God, not because I had all of the knowledge more than the other people, but I was able to come in, and someone said earlier, one of the things that allowed the door to open up for me was this. A smile, letting people know I'm here to do what I'm here to do, and you're not going to dissuade me because I know what I am doing. So I'm confident in doing that. So then as we look at what's going on with the resistance that's coming up to us, we must be confident that the story that we know is true, all right? Because we have the freedom in America not to believe. I preached one time about freedom and liberty. They go hand in hand, okay? You might have the freedom to do something, but not the liberty to do it. Or you may have the liberty to do something, but the law doesn't give you the freedom to do it. So you need both freedom and liberty to move forward. Now we have the liberty that we want to get the story out, but we not always have had the freedom to do it. Now that freedom is becoming ours, we must wield it, we must get the story out, and we must let everybody know what the truth is.
Thank you, Pastor Wimbish. I'm gonna try and wrap up our questions soon, because I want to give folks who are watching the opportunity to ask some questions. But let me ask you, what advice do you have for communities who are working to reclaim their stories?
Well, I would say making sure that, one, they have space, like safe space, to really have dialogue, right? People make it seem like one that all communities only have one story. You know, many communities have multiple stories. You know, we're a monolithic people. We're not a monolith. Most communities are not monolithic. And so making sure that there is space to have effective dialogue, and then making sure that those community members and those community residents' voices are valued, heard. When people feel valued and heard, they will tend to want to fight to ensure that their stories are being told and upheld. And so really is creating the space for community to give their voice, because so often institutions come talking to communities as opposed to talking with communities, right? And so creating that space. Sometimes communities have to have the meeting before the meeting, before they meet with institutions, to make sure that they're all with one voice and with one mind, or even coming to the consensus that with this one voice, we have several narratives that come out of us. But again, that's their power. That is the power that they get. And it goes back to your last question. You know, having your voice is reclaiming your power and making sure that you have the right apparatus to share that voice is power within itself. So making sure that there is protected space where community members can share their stories. You know, when the water crisis happened, the government tried to downplay Flint and say, oh, the people are just being hysterical. They're just overreacting, because they were trying to suppress the voice of the people. But you have to have those types of spaces where folks can actually share their voice and create community around shared narratives. That way, there's no way of really avoiding the fact that this is where what the heartbeat of the community is, and this is their story.
I think it's important to remember who you are, know your history, remember who you are, and don't get caught up in the divisive, they are community and I am my job description. Because who we are is we bring that to the table. And so just because I have a job description, that doesn't negate who I am as a person, the history. I've had people to say, oh, you're different, you're exceptional. No, I'm not going to be divided from the people that I came from. So remembering your history, remembering who you are, and then having the courage to speak with a collective voice as a leader, to speak on behalf of community, because we're in a time now where not only is the narrative being changed and redefined, community, the concept, the word, the whole phenomenon of community is in a process of being revised.
That was awesome. As we tell our story, so let's go to entertainment. As we tell our story, what is the story that we are putting out there for the future generations? Turn on your streaming TV, HBO, Paramount, whatever, Hulu, whatever you use. What is the plethora of images that we see that's supposedly telling our story? We also must change that. Okay, we must, when we attain to having the power to put a message out, like Dr. Taylor was saying, when we have that power, we must make sure that that message is the beneficial message that needs to be said. Okay, not just the feel-good message, not just the happy message, but the beneficial message that needs to be shared.
A question in the chat prompts this question I'm going to ask you. The church in the African American community has been a powerful means from the years of enslaved people. Can you each speak to the role of the African American church in holding place for the story of African Americans?
Well, I'll take a quick stab at that. Its place is extremely important. First of all, because it was a gathering place where there was a voice that could be heard by many people. Secondly, because oftentimes they gave opportunity for people to tell their own story. Here at Amazing Grace, after each service, we give people opportunity to tell us, what's going on, give a testimony, and we don't want someone to come and sugarcoat everything and sing and how great things are. Tell us exactly what's going on. Has someone in your family died with COVID? Has that impacted your work situation? So the church is a cog in that aspect of keeping the community story viable, and that others can hear it and share it. So I think that the church's place needs to continue to be there, because of the opposition that we have. I mean, people come to church 1 hour, 2 hours, maybe a week, maybe 4 hours a week, but the television is on, sometimes 20 hours a day. So they can hear all kinds of stories, objections, false or fake news, or whatever you want to call it. So the church has to remain steadfast in getting the truth out in a way that the community can be empowered by it. Empowering the individual leads to empowering the community.
He said it.
Cheryl, did you want to respond to that? Go ahead. Thank you, Pastor Wimbish.
I think he really encapsulated. All I can say is in our Reach 2010 at the Heart of New Orleans, that engaged over 50 churches focused on health, improving the health. And what's different about the way the African American churches we work with function, even though it was a research study targeting African American women, we don't believe in the exclusion of men because we're targeting women. So everyone had an opportunity to learn accurate information about promoting their health. But the data that we collected from the research purpose was on the women. And in order for that to happen, that required leadership, courage, and trust between the church leaders, the congregational leaders, and the scientists, educators. And also, let me just say this, as a member of the community, it helped because I was the principal investigator and also a member of the faith community. That all helped to make the initiatives happen. So I think it's important to not just show up at a church or any other community-based institution for the purposes of gathering data and you have no historical relationship with them.
Thank you. I'm going to jump to a question that somebody posed in the chat. And the question is, somebody has posed another one. How can your guidance today be effectively applied in other communities of color, such as Puerto Rico? Anybody want to take a stab at that? Dr. Keith?
I'll try. Here's the thing. So there are certain community engagement principles that can be used across different ethnic groups. And I know people are having conversations in the chat around using the word church so often, or Christianity. In this context, it is relevant to the African American experience. But if that's not your thing, or if that's not what's in your community, the church in this conversation just symbolizes a trusted institution in your community. So maybe it may not be a church in your community. It may be the local school, or it may be a local gathering place for seniors. Whatever the actual institution is, what we're saying is you can use effective community engaged principles. You can gather in these trusted areas, right? Where your leaders, those that have social capital, where your village, your tribe, your community has leaders that they respect. You have people that can filter information, translate information to make sure you're getting accurate information. Those are the types of things any community can do, whether you're in America, whether you're in Puerto Rico, whether you're in Cuba, wherever you are. You want to have a safe place. You want to have identified community leaders that can help sort through things. And it should be leaders that come from the community, not leaders that the institutions have knighted and dubbed as leaders, right? But then you also want to make sure that in that safe place, you can talk about true, authentic priorities that are meaningful to your community, and you can come up with community-driven solutions to get you to those priorities and to those goals. So this can be generalized to other communities and to other ethnicities and to other places. This has just been the experience that the panelists that we all happen to share. And mind you, we didn't know each other until today. We didn't know we had that commonality. However, this again is something that you can do. There are CBPR, community-based participatory principles. There are community engagement principles around the spectrum of community engagement. Then there are other participatory models that you can utilize, that you can implement in your community, in your circles, in your villages, in your tribes, that can be generalizable, that are basically takeaways, types of things.
But what's key to this is care, collaboration, and courage. That has to be a part of the oomph to move things, because when with our project, we were approached by people, especially when we became successful. Everybody wanted to jump on board, but we were at a developmental stage in terms of the actions that were needed to help the community, where we couldn't stop the project just to educate people to catch up. So what we did was we continued the work, but we referred people to the People's Institute Against Racism so they could learn and do the work so that they could help and be a part of any community that wanted to grow and develop. So we're challenged because this is complex, and it's important to maintain this capacity to care, collaborate, and have courage.
Pastor Wimbish?
Yes, and as we were speaking on just one part of a community, speaking of the church, and not everyone is going to be a member of a church or believe in God. I have in my family several different religions, and we don't beat each other up. We found our common goals. But as a pastor who worked into the scientific field, one thing that I know that science can never say what was the first cause, okay? And so that question is above a human being answered how things got started. So that's why I believe, you know, as the church tells a story of uplifting, of love, of hope, of respect for one another, that they could be a sounding board to improve the community. Will we do it 100% correctly? No, because unfortunately the church is made up of people, okay? And there are no perfect people if you're looking for a perfect organization. So as we move to tell the truth, we must all realize that none of us are 100% truthful all the time.
And
I'm sorry, Cheryl, I'm watching our time. Somebody put a note in the chat and I want us to speak to it. Lori Ann puts, our elders' historical contributions, she believes, are being lost and undervalued. What are your thoughts about that? That our elders, their historical contributions are being lost or not being valued as they should be in this whole thing of how our stories get told, to be respectful of Cheryl's distinction, how our narratives get told and how it shapes our destiny.
That's the absolute truth. They are being lost, and many of them are dying. Many of them are not being recognized. It's the elders in our communities are like living libraries. And when we lose our elders, these are living jewels. And so we should pay attention. You know, there's something called StoryCorps, and people get to go and tell the story, and it gets documented, I think, in the Library of Congress or different places. I think one of the things that we should pay more attention to is our elders, value them, and also get from them the history that they've experienced and use that and document it, and then also engage the library. We have elderly all across our communities that could come to the table as a council of elders.
Amen, amen. It was discussed earlier or recently about because of COVID, how many people have passed on from this life. And at the ceremonies, what we call funerals or homegoings, we found out a plethora of information about a person that we may have never known about them. Lori, I know her personally. She has a grandmother who was well over 100 years old before she passed. She had a lot of stories. I had an aunt who was 101 when she passed. And when we went to take the stuff out of her home, she had books there that I never knew that she had, that really opened up my eyes into what was going on in these United States. So our elders must be allowed and have a vehicle. Sometimes we are disconnected because the vehicles have changed. Well, they used to write letters and write books or write stories. Now everyone's looking at electronic devices for that information, but we need to find a way to get those stories into the hands of future generations.
The libraries can help. I think the libraries and librarians are an under recognized, powerful, valuable vehicle in all of our communities.
We are wrapping up, and I am particularly mindful of our time. Dr. Key has not yet sent me anything in the chat saying, my time is drawing nigh. But I just wanted to ask this question. Hopefully it will take us to the end. How does our narrative, another term for stories, help our communities confront the oppressive structures that we're dealing with? Dr. Key, I'm going to ask you to first respond. You sort of, in some of your comments talked about systems, institutions that are very much at the heart of disparities and racism, etc. So to the question, how do our narratives help communities confront oppressive structures?
Well, the truth of our narratives help us to confront those structures, and learning from past narratives, right? You learn from the things that maybe you didn't do well or that you missed. My grandmother used to say, if you don't learn a lesson, you have to repeat it, right? And so I think that understanding, being truth about the narrative, being truthful about what you did right and what you did wrong. We think about evaluation, right? You want to see those things that you did well and not so well. So through process evaluation, you can course correct. So I think that by learning from our narratives and gathering our narratives, we can actually course correct. We can actually create strategy. We can reinforce and do the things, redo what we've done well, and then reconstructing that we did not do well. And I think address racism as we address institutional inequities and disparities. But the key is making sure that you know what the narrative is. And I think that that's what's been the gist of this conversation is, do communities have the one space and the safe place to actually share their narrative? And then how do we ensure that those narratives are told? One thing about African culture, it's an oral tradition. A lot of traditions are told orally. Even in the African American experience, when you go to the family reunions, there's always those older uncles or aunts that share those stories that are not necessarily written in books. And so I think that it is very important that we collect those stories, those narratives, but that we then learn from them so that they can then guide us in the choices and the decisions that we make going forward.
Thank you, Dr. Key. Pastor Wimbish and then Cheryl.
Oh, I agree wholeheartedly with what he said. As we look at the history of mankind, one of the things that perhaps prevented our stories from being circulated powerfully around the world is exactly what Dr. Key said. It's because most of it was oral. Okay, the way that the gospel left Africa and went across the world is because they used the roads that the Romans built and the language that the Greeks had to get the message spread out. So if we look at the fact that the stories that we have now, if we could go back and catalog them and put them in the Library of Congress, and put them on TV when you see sayings of affirmations, then you would know more about our struggle and how we can and shall overcome. So yes, I agree. We have to change and get the story told, get it told correctly, and place it in places where people can actually see, hear, read it, and learn.
Thank you, Pastor Wimbish. Cheryl?
I believe honesty is the best policy. And I think it's important to be honest and be kind and recognize and value our history. And I think we can be informed and transformed by our accurate history. But I believe as we are called to be courageous, but we're called to be honest.
And with that, I see Janet has come on. And with that, I want to thank our panelists, Dr. Cheryl Taylor, Dr. Kent Key, and Pastor Lamont Wimbish for a very powerful conversation on the African American communities owning, reclaiming their stories in order to shape their destiny. Thank you so much for graciously agreeing to be part of this and providing your insight, valuable perspective on this as we continue to make every effort possible to the shaping of the stories using those of our ancestors as well as those who are older and have been in this fight for a very long time. Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you.
All
I would
right.
also like to thank the panelists for such a stellar presentation and for their thoughts. And Charmaine, you really, really did an incredible job hosting this panel and facilitating the questions and asking the right questions for these panelists to really share their insights. And we really do want to thank you as well. If you would like to share this link with anyone who missed this presentation that you know you'd like to share it with, please do. Our website has a great archive, so this will be the gift that keeps giving. It's .arizona.edu, missing the edu on the end. But if you want to click there and look at our archived programs, you will find this webinar. And I know that it's something that you would love to really promote the idea that this archive is there, and even though you can't get credit, the content's priceless. So please do let folks know, and we really would like to encourage you to complete that survey. We do value your opinion, and we do want to be sure that we do cover topics that are very relevant and would like to provide as a service as a Southwest Telehealth Resource Center presentations that you do find interesting and relevant. And today was definitely one of those. I'd like to thank you all. And thanks for coming, everybody.
Janet, before we go, I just want to say on behalf of the National Reach Coalition, we could not have done all these webinars and these series without you and the other wonderful folks at U of Arizona. So thank you so much for being so gracious in hosting these webinars for us. Thank you.
Our pleasure.
All right, take care, everyone.
I want to say thank you for documenting the work, because that's so important in terms of telling the stories.
Absolutely, absolutely, Cheryl. You're so right. All right, take care.
Thank you all.
Okay, bye-bye. Don't forget to do your surveys.